potential do you see for green walls in tall buildings?
Well, one of the premises of this conference is to make tall buildings, vertical urbanism, more sustainable, and making, and the paper that I presented this morning, or yesterday morning actually, spoke about residential buildings and tall buildings and precisely that. And one of the things is if more and more people are living in tall buildings, then, and more people are living in cities, then how do we bring kind of green features, green walls in particular, one type of a green feature, into residential environments that are vertical. So the potential is difficult. The panel I was on, management, there were questions about management, there were questions about how do you distribute costs of such design features like that. And one of the responses was, think about if you were adding a swimming pool at the base of a condominium building. That's a feature that gets added, that gets amortized over the cost of the building, and all the residents chip in some financial fashion. That's part of the pro forma operation of the building. Now, if you see green features like green walls, and the ability to have them kind of designed in a way that are a meaning part of your living environment, not just to the ground plane, but also kind of up at the upper levels of the building, then you'll find out ways to build it into the financial structure of the building.
So it's the same way that a shared amenity like a pool can be shared by everyone who enjoys it.
Yeah, so it's trying to look at, as society moves on, we start to see a broader mix of things. Initially, tall buildings were fascinating only because they provided certain amenities that were kind of modern and technological and things like that. But you don't want to throw away the other things which have to do with kind of quality of life, that have to do with the natural biophilic features of the environment too. And so the goal is now to try to bring those into the tall building environment in an equal way.
Is biophilia or biomimicry, are those concepts that you engage in?
Well, just kind of creating meaningful engagements with the natural environment in ways that people will enjoy. Outdoor spaces, even in a tall vertical environment, I think is a challenge and something that needs continued work and thinking in the design environment. Because what happens is the ecology does change. You're up there, you have different things, different winds, you have all sorts of different environmental factors that you have to respond to. So I think it's a good question about how to make outdoor spaces at high levels in buildings livable spaces, or spaces that people really want to use.
Yeah.
So not throwaway spaces. We see plenty of outdoor terraces that are just storage spaces, and it's trying to move beyond that in the high-rise building.
Right, and I guess a high-rise building of all programs, right? Office,
well,
residential.
True. Yes. I mean, high-rise buildings that have mixed-use communities that are really not just mixed use, but actually meaningful communities that integrate people, create a more dynamic living environment within a tall building, I guess would be another part of this goal of making tall buildings, vertical buildings, more sustainable in the long run.
Exactly.
Because the first motivation of tall buildings is one more about getting away from the ground plane and kind of removing yourself from the point of view of being exclusive or removed. And you see that in New York City, kind of the tall buildings are very at the highest echelons of kind of price point, kind of the most exclusive and things like that. And that's all fine on one level, but I think there's also a broader, more difficult challenge, which is actually how to make, take the vibrancy of life that you get at the ground plane on the city streets, and it might be a debate about whether this is doable or not, or even really worthwhile, but I think it at least is worth discourse.
Well, you absolutely...
And taking it up into the building and actually saying, can you create community spaces higher in a building? You see this in big mixed-use projects that really even something, Sky Lobbies is just a starting point, where basically you create public spaces higher in a building that really encourage interaction from a broad array of individuals that might be occupying the building.
You pretty much lead right into it perfectly. What does qualify as a vertical community in your mind as opposed to just a mixed-use building with a bunch of disparate uses stacked on top of one another?
Well, you could have, a standard building is just it's a set of standard plates, and the question is, community implies interaction, I think. So I think that would be the connectivity, certain porosity or connectivity within the upper levels of the building, so that they actually create community rather than just isolated pods or isolated floors, whether they be 2 or 200 feet high, that kind of thing, or 200 stories high for that matter.
Yeah.
So communities would require, in my mind, community would require kind of an idea of interaction among people.
Hmm.
So
Speaking of creating community in tall buildings, on the subject of affordable housing or social housing, how is tall social or affordable housing, or has it been a failure? And does it need to change? If so, what needs to change about making high-rise
Well,
living, affordable and a true community for people of all walks of life?
going back 30 plus 40 years now, kind of the first attempts at affordable, I'll use a word that probably isn't right, social or housing that was kind of provided at an affordable price to, in a high-rise scenario, many of those were failed attempts. They didn't work. They created environments that one might have called, that weren't taken care of, that didn't provide a good, didn't provide either a good ground plane environment or a good environment high up in the building as the residential unit. And that, so one might say that those were failed attempts. The question is, why did they fail? I think if the tall buildings are designed in ways that actually the upper spaces do have stronger sense of community, do have a better mix of types of spaces that aren't just dark corridors that link to units, and so those corridors are not spaces that people will take care of or appreciate. But if you kind of create spaces within the building just the way you think of street spaces or things that people like to take kind of ownership over and kind of have and create public interaction around and things like that, if you can do that within tall buildings, then you might create communities within tall buildings that will actually sustain themselves, because they'll be more meaningful, people will appreciate them and enjoy and want to kind of get more out of their, really create a stronger bond within the community, within the building.
So more conscious design that's oriented around community from the start might actually foster that community.
And you might wonder whether the tall buildings that were failures had any of that within them or not.
Pick a design, a tall building design, construction, operations, management problem that you think deserves more research, and tell us why.
Well, it's interesting how I know there's been a lot of, the main research right now has to do with BMS or building management systems and how they're being used to help manage buildings, and how that's tied into the design process and the systems that are designed in the building and then provided, and then having 3D or computer generated models that are able then to be taken by the management property operations managers and kind of used by them to help actually manage and control and better understand the performance of the buildings. Because I think the real goal is to see, in the end, to kind of monitor performance and understand if the performance, how it relates to actually the design assumptions that were made, and how to then actually make sure that the performance can either be improved upon or at least is in accordance with the anticipated goals.
Sure, so validating what you set out to do in the first place.
Right, and also getting the most out of it, because no matter how well a system is designed, if it's not kept up and if it's not used properly, well then it probably isn't going to perform, certainly in the short term or the long term for that matter.
So I guess the topic would be verification, or how would you
Well,
crystallize
verification
that?
is one part of it, yeah. Well, just verification or analysis about whether or not something is really, there sometimes false assumptions are made, and there's not always the right systems are put together. So I heard one talk yesterday about, the talk about tri-generation and whether using tri-generation was actually a good fit for this, whether the design solution was a good fit for the ultimate application, that kind of thing. Trying to verify those things.
That was in Australia, right, that project? Tri-generation?
I'm not certain.
I
can't speak. I'm not sure.
Well, I think, especially with regards to building performance, which is a big part of verifying the outcome of your design assumptions, that's going to be increasingly more important with climate change, especially around the topic of disaster resilience, climate resilience. So, what changes do you think we'll need to accept or deal with in building conditioning as a result of climate change?
Well, it's interesting being here and realizing a different sense of, the climate here being, well, in some ways, I think of New York as being a humid climate, but certainly it's more humid here. And I've kind of appreciated that the buildings, this could be a wrong assumption, but it seemed like there's less focus here on intense, the internal environment is not super conditioned. It's actually not, it's less conditioned than I thought, than I expected here.
Mm-hmm.
So my first thing is that I think part of climate change is that we should we should acknowledge that we should try to live with real climates the way they are, and not try to foster or kind of create artificial climates everywhere we go. So, and as climates get more extreme, then I think you also have to figure out ways to not modify those climates, but figure out how to have built environments that that make comfortable environments through more passive means, or more ways that are less about creating kind of distinction between inside and outside an artificial environment versus kind of the environment that you see kind of in an uncontrolled environment. So.
So I guess changing lifestyle a little bit as well.
A little bit, I think, is part of it. Acknowledgement that climates are things that need to be lived with and kind of learned how to, adjusted to and appreciated.
Yeah. What role do you think the architect plays in that and in the broader question of addressing sustainability?
Well, we have to push for, well-ventilated buildings, I think, is a big part of it. Naturally ventilated buildings is a big plus of that, although I know it's a challenge from all systems points of view in terms of design, but it's, I think architects can push that, because I know it's, from an operations point of view, sometimes that's not always desired. From a design point of view on the mechanical systems, it's not always desired. You get a lot of pushback, but as architects you can at least advocate and work with your team to try to figure out creative ways to integrate systems with both passive and active systems to create kind of more resilient responses to climate and indoor-outdoor environments.
I think it's really interesting to think about that, the way you put it, in terms of sort of adapting a lifestyle, at least acknowledging some of things that we might have to do with regards to climate change, because the role of the architect, you kind of, you're always kind of between wanting to give people what they already want and creating an environment in which they can still achieve all the same things that they wanted with maybe less energy or with a different lifestyle in some way, shape, or form. So I think when it comes to the architect's role in moving the needle on sustainability, especially with the ventilation issues you've raised, it's sort of an interesting balance, right? To, tell people this is the new building, this is the new building type, this is the new conditioning regime that we really need to live with, and this is time to get ready for it. And still making sure that people are comfortable.
It's a challenge because you can't, as an architect, you are on one level a service profession. We have to acknowledge that a little bit, but we also we're helping shape the products that are made, and you can't tell anyone the way they should or shouldn't, live. But you do also have, as a specialist with respect to the technologies that are out there, at least one aspires to kind of understand them and understand how to apply them in the built environment. I think you do have a kind of greater role in helping shape how those technologies are evolving and what kind of design studies or explorations are conducive to helping improve the technologies so that we can come up with better solutions.